Hello, BookTube. This channel recently hit 7,600 subscribers, and because that has a couple of zeros on the end, the natural reflex after all this time is to do a Q&A. So I put out a call, and I got bombarded with great questions. So we're going to do a 7.6K Q&A, and we're going to start now. And once again, I'm going to try and keep these videos to about 30 minutes each, and we'll just see how many we need to get through all of these. First one is from Hiba Aduchana. Greetings from Abu Dhabi. Well, isn't that a nice way to start? Hello. Number one, love seeing your book reviews in the National. That is an English language newspaper in Abu Dhabi. How did you get to write for them? Well, it's a long and kind of funny story. They emailed Open Letters Monthly, the online literary journal that was a predecessor to Open Letters Review. I was the managing editor at the time, and they were looking for someone else. They took me instead. But I haven't written for the National in a while. I think their budget was hit by the pandemic, same as everybody else's. So I don't have any forthcoming pieces for them. I'm hoping that you will see me in the pages of the National again this year, but you never know. And then a second question, any thoughts on Magyfus? I like him quite a bit. Favorite novel by him? Well, it's natural for an English-speaking audience to say the Cairo trilogy, or the first book in the Cairo trilogy, but I like Adrift on the Nile quite a bit, even though it commits all of the sins you'd think would make me hate it. It is silly in its dramatic construction. It's meandering. It's formless. It's self-indulgent. You would think that, I mean, I never stop criticizing contemporary literary fiction because of those same flaws, but in Mahfouz's case, I think it works for Adrift on the Nile. And number three, do you see writing mainly as a tool for communication, or do you also write to figure out what you think for yourself? Would love to see you make more AuthorTube videos. Yes, I absolutely should make more AuthorTube videos. I should do one a week at least. But in terms of the question, I once upon a time poo-pooed that very idea, the inversion of that I will write about something in order to learn what I think about it. That seems so anti-Jesuitical. It seems like you should know exactly what you think about it before you write about it. But nevertheless, I have found it to be true when writing book reviews. When it comes time to write, always the first draft, of course, never anything. I'm not going to work anything out on paper in front of an audience. But I have found that in many cases, working out your thoughts in the actual act of writing, rather than sitting and pondering or going to a still pond or whatever it is that deep people do, I found that actually does help. So I would never commit the John Leonard style infamy of flopping around and working things out in the finished piece. But I do, when I'm writing, I do often come to conclusions that I didn't see coming, where I'll be writing a draft of review, and I will suddenly realize 400 words in, wow, you didn't like this book. You didn't like it. You went into this review thinking that maybe you did, or that maybe you were neutral, but you actually didn't like it. And you're only figuring that out as you try to enunciate it all. So Mary Tumulty says, please share your thoughts on the early 20th century novels of Henry Green, Party-Going, Living, and Loving. Well, certainly I'll have a chance to write a piece about my thoughts on those novels, since the literary world, the worst part of it, the part I hate, the Williamsburg part of it, never stops trying to revive Henry Green. Never. They never stop trying to make him suddenly a household name, suddenly an author that everybody loves and embraces. They've tried real hard with Stoner. They've tried real hard with these three novels. And I always want to say to such people who always look down their nose at me, always they do, I always want to say to them two things. Number one, if you want to look down your nose at me when it comes to all things literary, let's line up. I'm happy to put my brain against yours when it comes to all things books, if you've got any meat to back up that condescension. But second, I want to say, well, there's a reason why you keep failing to do this. And it might have something to do with Henry Green himself. But maybe he's not anything like as good as what you're saying he is. Because the literati, they are so bored with talking about books, mainly because they don't read them. They read 10 books a year. That they have to come up with a cause or something new, something odd or counterintuitive. They have to do that. And then it becomes a bandwagon because so many of them are bored. Well, Your boredom with your reading is not my fault. I am not at all bored with my reading. I don't have enough time in the day or night to do it, and I'm reading all the time. So you want to make a god out of Karl Ove Knausgaard, or out of Sally Rooney, or whoever the next wet wash nothing will be, you go right ahead. You want to go back into the past out of boredom and say that Don Powell was the greatest American author, or that Henry Green is an absolutely A-rank great author, out of boredom, go right ahead. But don't implicate me. Don't bring me along. I don't have any problem with it. Well, anyway. John O'Doherty has a number of questions. Number one, do you think Gore Vidal would have done well had he been voted into Congress? No. Number two, have you ever been inclined to enter politics? No. No. The world needs the Steve Doctrine, the one that has every Federal Reserve resource transferred to the reprinting of forgotten classic industry. Well, there wouldn't be a Federal Reserve if I were in political power, but that'd be just one change among many. But trust me, you don't want me to be in politics. Maybe one thing that might be interesting. At least you'd get interesting speeches. But to have political power, you don't want that. Trust me, you don't. And question number three, on that note, why is Anthony Burgess' nonfiction so hard to come by? Is his work worth the worldwide hunt? Well, I don't know why it's so hard to come by. Burgess himself is slightly in the shade. People don't talk about him. The aforementioned pretentious Williamsburg literati don't talk about him. They don't mention him. They don't read him. No major reprint publishing houses that do anything like his whole stuff. There was an ongoing complete, but that's hard to do with an author as prolific as Anthony Burgess. People don't know him. They don't tend to reference him or allude to him at all. And his nonfiction less than his fiction. And that's a terrible shame, because his nonfiction, as I've mentioned many times on this channel, is fantastic. But I've heard horror stories over the years from people, especially in Australia, the benighted gigantic island where I have never been. Benighted because, as far as I can tell, I have talked to hundreds of Australians, all different kinds of life, all different parts of the country. And as far as I can tell, Australia actively hates books. Just actively hates books and literary leanings, reading of any kind. The books are a little mass market paperback is $75 US. It costs $1,500,000 to mail a hardcover from anywhere in the world to Australia. There are no literary events. There's barely any literary magazines. There's hardly any literary activity. I don't understand why that is. I really don't. Australia had a wrong side of the tracks rough founding, but so did the United States. And we value the literary world, at least a little. Australia seems to actively hate it. So I don't understand. When you say worldwide hunt, I'm assuming that you're emailing from Australia. The nonfiction of Anthony Burgess, his collected nonfiction, and especially his amazing 2-volume memoir, Big Wilson and Little God and You've Had Your Time, they're incredible books. So is it worth the time and huge back-breaking, family-ending expense that Australia puts on all things literary? I don't really know. I don't know how I can say that, but a hunt of some kind? Sure. Yes, it absolutely is. Matt Crash says, your thoughts on Zack Snyder's Superman films? They stink. Adam says, I am new to your channel, so I apologize if these have been asked before. Never apologize for that. Never worry at all. I'm happy. I grouse all the time about how there are too many mouths to feed, but I'm happy that there are so many of you. I'm happy that more people find this channel and seem to like it. And it is absolutely inevitable, considering how many Q&As I have done. It's absolutely inevitable that you're going to ask questions that people have asked before. Don't even worry about it. Don't even worry about it. Welcome to the channel. Hope you stick around. And also, when we come to question, I should have prefaced with this. Once again, as I always say on these Q&As, I am bulk transporting these questions from the comment section of the video where I called for them to a Google Doc. So if I missed a question of yours, or if I truncated or something or other, don't get upset. Don't worry. Just ask it again. The Q&A will come around again, I feel sure, and you just ask it again. But anyway, question number one, you've mentioned that you came to reading late. How did this happen, and what was your progression like reading? As in, did you immediately start reading voraciously, and did it happen over time? The way that it happened is that I had a great teacher who introduced me to books. I knew that books existed, but he introduced me to books. He introduced me to the fact that books were an adventure, that they were a world, that they were a never-ending source of joy. And once he knocked those scales from my eyes, I could not read enough. That is when my voracious reading started. Question number 2, how is your recollection of the books that you've read? I imagine this depends a lot on the book, but I wonder how much detail you can generally remember, especially after a long time. My recollection of the books I've read is fairly good. Question number 3, do you eat meat? No. Question number 4, in your 21st century literary canon video, you mentioned that there are a lot of books being published that we will still be reading years from now, but you seem generally critical of a lot of trends in contemporary literary fiction. Do you think canon-worthy books are being published at a slower rate now than in other periods, and if so, why? Would you consider making a video listing the 21st century books you think will stand the test of time? I thought the 21st century literary canon video was that kind of a video. But in terms of your question, do you think canon-worthy books are being published at a slower rate now than in other periods, and if so, why? No, I don't. I don't think they are that really worthy or great books are being published at a slower rate, but I do think they're harder to spot because more books are being published. And a great number of C-level only average works, especially in terms of literary fiction, are being called the greatest things that have ever been written in the history of the world. And that fogs up the background. That creates a lot of noise, a lot more noise than previous generations had to cut through because there's more of it. If you seize on an absolutely bored and boring, racist, misogynist nonentity who has published a book about 20-something nihilists, if you seize on that person and say, well, this book, because I found it so falling off the toilet easy to read, has got to be the greatest book that's ever been written, and you skip over the part about how you haven't read anything that was written before your birth. if you say that every single book season about at least one book that is destined for the trash heap, that is just junk, you're going to create a lot of background noise, and it's going to be harder to pick out the great ones, the books that actually are great. A perfect example would be, unfortunately, the literary reaction sphere, what Gore Vidal called the book chat world. Look at that world in any given year. There'll always be a handful, probably 3, literary fiction books that most of that world is just herniating themselves to praise. Where are those books from 6 years ago? They're gone. They're out of print. The authors have gone on to coding. They're not remembered. No one talks about them. No one cares about them, including their erstwhile champions. It's a pattern that most of the lit chat world has got into, to hyper overpraise non-entities season by season just because everybody else is doing it. All the more reason why you should always check with what Steve thinks, because I don't jump on literary bandwagons. If you're worried, if you're wondering about a book from the last, 20 years, just go to, if you Google my name and best or worst lists, you will find I've been keeping a year-end list of best and worst books in the 15 genres that I read for decades now. And I don't jump on bandwagons. And as you know, if you watch this channel, I read a lot. In a given year, I read more books in more genres than the whole book departments of some newspapers. So I'm keeping, it's not just that I'm a mole furrowing in a lawn. I am actually keeping an eye on a wider context. So no, the rate is the same. Great books take an enormous amount of effort to do. They are squeezed out in the wee small hours. But they get lost in the sea of boring wetwash that is praised by the booker. So I could do a whole video on that, but the video that I did, I would refer you to. You mentioned it, so you must have watched it. That's kind of what it was meant to be. Let's see here. Scalawag says, number 1, of the many myriad prequels and sequels to Treasure Island, are there any you think are worthy companions to the original? No. Number 2, thoughts on the Inspector Dover mysteries of Joyce Porter? I don't think I've read them. Any other bumbling, incompetent protagonists whose misadventures you'd recommend? That's just too easy. I'm not going to sink to it. No, I don't have an example. No, there was one once upon a time, but I have a hard time remembering the details of it. I should dig them out. It's relatively recent, and it was a series of murder mysteries starring a middle-aged, pompous Indian gentleman who thinks much more highly of himself than is warranted, and who has a very pompous, wonderful way of talking. And contrary to my answer to an earlier question about how well I remember the things I read, whenever I think about it, I think, is that series still going on? I'd love to read it. The first two were so good, but off the top of my head, I can't give you the details, either of the main character's name, which would be enough to find it on Google, or the author's name, or the series name. But I will. If I can, I will leave it in the notes, because it's a good example of the bumbling protagonist. Winifred Lee says, question number 1, inspired by Claire's question. Oh, did I get to Claire's question yet? Probably not. What does sexual liberation mean to you? Do you think it's a good thing that people by the millions are posting their near-naked bodies online? Is it liberation, or is it closer to narcissism? As an example, it makes no sense to me how many of the world's top models are considered leading feminists. Like, their livelihood is based off of how they look. Am I missing something here? No, no, you aren't. I can understand it with social media, especially Instagram, if you have a professional reason to do this. Like, for instance, on Instagram, I follow and am followed by a number of statuesque weightlifters, most of whom are online personal trainers. So they have a business. Their body is their business. It's their calling card. And that is not the only reason why they post thousands of semi-naked pictures of themselves. They do it, as you mentioned quite rightly, for rampant, uncontrolled narcissism. But partly it's professional. Partly they're doing it because they want you to see that I got these results for myself, I can get them for you. I know that I've shifted the ground of the question here just a little, but it's close. When it comes to male online physique trainers, that implied claim, and a lot of them make that claim explicitly, I did this for my own body, I can do this for you. That implied claim is explicitly a lie. And you can tell because they've been narcissists their whole life. So their Facebook feed and their Instagram feed go all the way back to when they were in high school, and you can see that these are just people who are genetically gifted. They may have sculpted a physique with lots of ridiculous weightlifting exercises, like throwing a ball onto the ground, or flopping an industrial nautical hawser up and down on the ground. Utterly ridiculous. The only reason they get away with it without yanking something right out of its socket is because they're in their 20s. But that may have honed things a little, but you see that for a lot of their clients, so to speak, nothing like those results is ever going to happen. And they're also complete hypocrites because they eat like children and they smoke nonstop. So, but in answer to your question, do I think it's a good idea that millions of people are posting irresponsibly online? You mentioned that maybe it's narcissism. Or that some people would call it liberation. The thing that worries me about it isn't either one. It isn't personal at all. It's practical. Because when you post that information willy-nilly, it doesn't belong to you anymore. You're giving it to the platforms that you're posting it on. And you might think that the herd protects you, that if hundreds of millions of people are doing this, that it'll never come back to haunt you. But I would worry about that. And I would worry about it a lot more as we enter the realm of deep fakes. I think, as I've said on this channel many times, we should all be more careful of our data, which is kind of ironic for me to say since I'm answering tons of questions on an open platform. But anyway, and question number 2, can I Zoom call you? Of course you can. Yes, as I've made clear on this channel recently, I have cracked Zoom technology, and I described the process. That I downloaded the app with the careful supervision of a young friend who walked me through how it works and offered his services to edit the end results. So the cross chat and the mumbo jumbo at the beginning, the cross chat and the mumbo jumbo at the end, he would edit those off because I, of course, have no editing ability at all. And that's great. That's an absolute boon. That's all I need, really, to launch into Zoom conversations one after another after another. But yesterday I tried an experiment. I used Matthew at Mayberry Book Club as my guinea pig to see what would happen if I got all that crosstalk mumbo jumbo out of the way in an initial Zoom call of a few minutes, and then made sure to clarify to my victim that the next Zoom call, the one I make in a minute, is going to be all business. So I'm going to start by talking to BookTube. I'm going to start by introducing them, and when I say I'm wrapping things up in 30 minutes. We are wrapping things up, and that's what will happen. So, and it worked. It absolutely worked. Now, a lot of that I'm attributing to Matthew's a terrific interview, but I'm thinking that can work in the future as well. So you can Zoom me. Yes, absolutely. I would think there's a good balance to be struck between Zoom conversations with authors and Zoom conversations with other booktubers. The only possible problem being the flip side of the same problem for each group. One, authors, it's difficult to get them to shut up in 30 minutes. It's difficult to get them to wind things down. They have so much to talk about. And on the flip side of that, it might be difficult for just an average booktuber to go on for any length of time in great detail. It might be interesting. I'm fairly good as an interviewer, so I can ask questions that other people will find interesting. But yes, absolutely, I will work it all out because I want to do a lot of these things. I'm not, in fact, Zooming anyone today, and I'm feeling the lack. A scorched your Sriracha Chicken? Oh, goodness gracious. Well, I'm sure I didn't do that justice. But question number 1. Did Hugh Laurie's American accent in House MD convince you? Yes. The director said that during the casting interview, they didn't even notice he was English. Any other actors who did. Well, it's not the story that the casting directors do. I know that the onset anecdotes and Hugh Laurie's own anecdotes and the Blu-ray extras on House MD are full of examples where his English accent would just come bursting out and they would have to reshoot the scene. So I don't know. That sounds like a conflicting opinion there. Question number 2. Since George Martin died without finishing A Song of Ice and Fire, in case any of you are alarmed and you're going straight to Google, that is an in-joke on this channel. I have often maintained that George R.R. Martin is effectively dead, but certainly that he's never going to finish this series, that he'll die before he does it. Any other hyper-violent or dark fantasy to recommend to us? I heard a lot about The Witcher by Andrew Sapkowski. Well, I did too, and I one of you very generously sent me The Witcher, the ebooks of The Witcher, and I read the first 2, and it didn't do anything for me. I don't know. Maybe you need Henry Cavill's shoulders to make it convincing, but I do have recommendations. I jotted some of them down. The First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. And Anthony Ryan's Raven's Shadows book. Those are really good as well. That's a little underrated series, but very good. And of course, the Black Company books by Glenn Cook. It's sort of the granddaddy of them all, 30 years before these things, but well worth your time, especially if you like military fantasy. Oh my, don't miss the Black Company books. And question number 3, thoughts on Haldor Laxness and on Icelandic literature in general. Do you know any authors other than that? And I don't really know. It's a shame too, because it's a hyper-literary tradition, but I don't know it well enough. Question number 4, would you consider Pynchon to be the greatest American novelist alive? That's an awful tough call. I might give it to Marilyn Robinson instead. And number 5, what could be done to restore a minimal amount of credibility to the Nobel Prize for Literature? Well, that'd be easy. You'd need to do 2 things. Number 1, call together the Nobel Committee and have them officially revoke Bob Dylan's prize. They gave the Nobel Prize for Literature to a 90-year-old cokehead who isn't even literate. He can't read. He didn't write any of the lyrics for which they gave him this prize, and he sang them very poorly. You and I in the bathroom with no recording equipment other than the microphone on your phone could do a better job of singing all of those lyrics. And Dylan didn't understand them. He remembered them from ample recording sessions, but he can't read. He certainly never sits down to ponder and write with a goose quill pen. It's an absolute travesty that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. It is a big neon sign saying, don't take us seriously. So, number 1, the existing Nobel Prize Committee should revoke his prize. They should say, this was an error, we revoke it. Bob Dylan is not a winner of the Nobel Prize. He will not be on the list of winners in the future. That's thing number 1. If you don't do that, then none of the rest of it matters, because you gave the Nobel Prize to Ed the Talking Horse. And that means you don't care. That means all you want is the headlines. And the second thing is for as soon as they do that, then the entire judging committee has to resign. And an entirely new committee, every bit, from the supervisors all the way down to the judges themselves, all of it has to be rebuilt. Using strong existing literary criteria. So you should not be building a new judging committee based on gender or skin color. That's not going to happen. The Nobel Prize in Literature, the judging committee made a horrible gaffe when they returned. Or at least the judging committee took a year off, then they came back and they split a prize, and one half of the prize went to a genocide apologist. Peter Hanke. And the only thing that was talked about anywhere in the literary reaction sphere, in the news, anywhere, the only thing that was talked about were his political opinions and how offensive they are. And that made me just hang my head. So, because that is not what... It may be that the Nobel is not salvageable. But at the very least, those are the first two things you have to do. You have to revoke Bob Dylan's prize. That has to happen first. And then you have to just totally reconstitute your judging panel. Get rid of everybody and replace them with other people. Mary Tumulty asks, would you consider resuming a Lonely Trollop read-along to coincide with Victober? Oh, yes, that's a great idea. I've let our Lonely Trollops slide, and I shouldn't do that, because they're a lot of fun. A lot of you really like them. So, and Victober's a perfect example, because he's a great Victorian author. So, yes, absolutely, we will pick a Lonely Trollop for Victober, and next week, I will figure out which one we're going to do, and I'll announce it. How are we doing? Okay, let's do one more. Joseph Green says, how have you remained curious throughout your 28 years? Can curiosity be cultivated, or is it something a person is blessed with? No, it can be cultivated. Yes, there are some obstacles in the way. Egotism will get in the way. I know that's a little odd coming from me, since I seem to have no lack of egotism. You have to be willing to learn, and in order to do that, you have to be willing to admit there's plenty you don't know, and that what you do know might be wrong. But one way or another, I firmly believe that it's learnable, but I nevertheless feel gifted. I absolutely love the fact that I am bursting with curiosity about almost everything. I just love that fact. Can't imagine what it'd be like if that weren't true. And Joseph Green has a second question. Would you smoke a cigarette if it meant you could have at your fingertips every book lost to history? No. And then we're going to wrap this up, and I'll be right back for part 2 here.